They told us it was a place of God, a sanctuary where young men sought holiness, wisdom, and purpose, but buried beneath the vaulted ceilings and immaculate chapel walls of Sacred Heart Seminary was a hunger older than the church itself, one that did not pray to the light, but to the shadows. In 1862, a low-ranking Vatican archivist named Matteo Ferrara uncovered a set of crumbling, blood-stained correspondences sealed within a hollowed beam beneath the seminary's chapel. The letters, written in a mix of Latin and Gaelic, told of human trafficking rings run not by godless brigands or backwoods bandits, but by the priests themselves. They whispered of boys taken, souls traded, bodies discarded in secret mass graves beneath the chapel's stone floors. A conspiracy so deep that when Ferrara reported it to his superiors, he vanished before dawn. His room left in perfect order, his personal effects stacked neatly on the bed. No record of him exists after that day. And Sacred Heart? It was shuttered within a year. Officially, they claimed it was financial mismanagement, dwindling enrollment, frontier hardships. But the land was salted, the chapel razed, the stone foundations pulled down and burned in great pyres of sanctified fire, and all remaining parishioners were warned under pain of excommunication to never speak its name again. But names hold power, and forgotten names, they hold dominion. Tonight you will hear what you were never meant to hear. Not folklore, not campfire tales, the documented, suppressed record of what truly transpired within those hallowed halls, because the Vatican never destroyed the final ledger. It passed through quiet hands for generations, each bearer adding their mark, their confession, their terror. And now, it's mine. If you've stumbled upon this video by accident, leave now. This knowledge is not safe for the casual, the indifferent, the weak. But if you feel the pull, that gnawing need for forbidden truths, for the marrow of history stripped bare, then stay. In the next few minutes, I will show you how faith was weaponized, how sacred symbols masked predatory hungers, and how an entire generation of young men vanished into shadow. But before we begin, comment below the phrase, "No light without shadow," twice. Mark yourself as one who sees, one who remembers. The descent begins now. In 1845, the Illinois prairie was a wilderness, a vast, untamed expanse where the sky pressed low and the wind spoke in voices that no sane man claimed to understand. It was here, on 400 acres of lonely land, that Sacred Heart Seminary was born, and it didn't rise by accident. The land itself had a name long before the church claimed it. The native tribes called it Tekahtaha, meaning the place of the sleeping bones. A place where nothing grew right, where animals vanished, where entire families of settlers left in the night, their cabins abandoned, meals half-eaten on rough-hewn tables. Rumors spoke of burial mounds older than any tribe, marked with stones etched in symbols no scholar could decipher. Yet in 1845, Bishop William Quarter of Chicago, under pressure from both the Vatican and wealthy Catholic families desperate to establish an American-born clergy, decreed this land would be the foundation of their holiest institution in the Midwest. It is no coincidence they chose this cursed soil. The church has always sought such places, liminal spaces, thin spots where the boundary between worlds softens. They mask these actions with claims of missionary zeal, of sanctifying the land. But history shows us again and again, where the veil is weak, power can be taken. The building of Sacred Heart was rushed, even reckless. Laborers, mostly poor Irish immigrants, toiled through blizzards and droughts. There were accidents, too many to be ignored. Men crushed by falling beams. Others who drowned mysteriously in shallow wells. One worker's entire crew disappeared overnight, leaving only bloodstains in the half-finished stone chapel. But the priests insisted construction continue. Father Edmund Walsh, a towering figure with an ice-grey stare and a voice like cracked marble, drove the men mercilessly. He claimed the accidents were tests of faith, that the devil opposed their work because it threatened his dominion in the wilderness, and the people, ignorant, afraid, and desperate for salvation, believed him. The cornerstone was laid on August 6, 1845. a date that, unknown to the workers, coincided with the ancient festival of Lugnasad, a Gaelic harvest rite associated with sacrificial offerings to spirits of the land. The ceremony was conducted in Latin by Walsh himself, and in place of the traditional holy relic, a human femur was sealed within the foundation stone. Who the bone belonged to, no record survives, but in the months that followed, every horse, every ox, and every child within 3 miles was born with a milky film over their eyes, and at night the fields shimmered with a phosphorescent light as if the earth itself had begun to rot from within. They called it a miracle. They always do. By the winter of 1847, Sacred Heart Seminary was complete, a towering, blood-red brick fortress rising out of the prairie like a wound on the land. The townsfolk of Milfield kept their distance. The wind never sounded right around the building, they'd say. Birds wouldn't fly over it. Travelers lost their way trying to approach it, but those warnings went unheeded by the men of the cloth. The seminary's chapel was its crown jewel, a cathedral in miniature, with soaring Gothic arches, hand-carved pews imported from Bavaria, and stained glass windows depicting scenes not of Christ's mercy, but of the Old Testament God, wrathful, vengeful, unyielding, figures weeping in chains, angels with burning swords, men being cast down into pits of flame. It was no accident. Father Walsh claimed the imagery was chosen to remind students of sin's terrible consequences, but older records suggest those windows mirrored ancient grimoires held in private Vatican collections, illustrations of celestial punishments meant not to deter sin, but to evoke awe at the hierarchy of suffering, a blueprint for power through fear. The library was equally suspect. While boasting over 3,000 volumes of theology and classical philosophy, it also contained texts no accredited seminary would ever permit. Alchemical treatises by Paracelsus, the Picatrix, a medieval book of planetary magic, and most damning of all, a hand-bound, illuminated manuscript bearing no title, but known to its keepers as Liber Somniorum Inferni, the Book of Hellish Dreams. Said to be written by an excommunicated monk in 1427, it chronicled rituals for piercing the veil between this world and what lay beneath. None of this was known to the students, of course. 12 young men, each chosen carefully, sons of wealthy families, politically inconvenient heirs, or particularly gifted boys whose loyalty could be cultivated. Then, they came from Milwaukee, Chicago, St. Louis, and Detroit, drawn by promises of holy service, rigorous education, and honor within their communities. But here's what no one outside those blood-red walls understood. Sacred Heart wasn't built to teach. It was built to separate, to identify those with a certain hunger, the ones willing to trade comfort for power, security for dominance, heaven for authority. And the others, well, they wouldn't be missed. The first night, every student was ordered to recite an obscure Latin prayer before sleep, a verse absent from any known liturgy. It spoke of binding the flesh, stilling the soul, and granting passage to the gatekeeper of hollow lands. They thought it tradition. They had no idea what door they were opening. It's important you understand something about the mid-19th century church, especially in the American frontier. It was a crucible of power and terror disguised as piety. The Vatican didn't merely export missionaries, they exported control systems, psychological mechanisms engineered to command loyalty, crush dissent, and isolate the vulnerable. Sacred Heart Seminary wasn't just a school, it was a proving ground. The students were subjected to a regimen harsher than any European monastery. They rose at 4:30 a.m. to a bell that was said to have been cast from the melted-down manacles of executed criminals. Before speaking a word, they had to kneel barefoot on the freezing stone floor and repeat the phrase, Ad tenebras me vocas, Domine. To the darkness you call me, Lord. No official Catholic text records this prayer. They fasted on bread and water for days at a time, were forbidden to speak more than 3 sentences outside of recitation hours. Their letters home were intercepted, rewritten, or burned entirely. No visitors allowed without written permission from the Vatican representative in Chicago, which rarely, if ever, came. But the most sinister aspect wasn't the deprivation, it was the testing. Each week, students were led one by one into the basement chapel, a damp, windowless chamber beneath the main structure. There, under flickering candlelight, they were made to confess their darkest desires. Not sins they'd committed, but thoughts, temptations, imaginations. The priests insisted that only by exposing these demonic whispers could the students be purified. But this was no act of spiritual cleansing. Father Walsh and his cohorts took detailed notes. The most violent, the most defiant, the most sexually disturbed, these students were marked for different purposes. Some were encouraged, elevated, given private tutoring in obscure ancient language, and lost religious rites. Others were isolated, broken down psychologically, and when they ceased to be useful, they disappeared. The townspeople of Milfield would later whisper that strange wagons came and went by night, covered carts with muffled wheels, and sometimes long, narrow boxes, the kind no priest would admit to needing. No official records survive of where those boxes went, or what, or who they carried. The students, meanwhile, learned quickly to keep their heads down, to pretend not to notice when a classmate vanished, to accept that letters would go unanswered, that questions brought punishment, that the seminary's sacred ground was soaked in more than holy water. But for one of them, Joseph Kennedy, silence would not be an option. Joseph Kennedy wasn't like the others. The son of a moderately successful merchant in Chicago, Joseph hadn't come to Sacred Heart for power, nor for family prestige. He came chasing the voice of God, a quiet, intense young man with a keen mind and a dangerous habit for asking questions. The priests recognized it immediately. The ones who prey on others can always smell the defiant, the incorruptible, and where other students flinched or learned to avert their gaze, Joseph stared directly into the unsettling truths of Sacred Heart. He noticed the first disappearance before anyone else dared speak of it. Michael Brennan, a bright, earnest seminarian from Chicago's South Side, vanished in the middle of a blizzard, with no footprints in the snow, no farewell letter, no borrowed coat or boots for the journey. Officially, they said he'd left to tend to cholera victims in a distant Iowa parish, a noble lie. But Joseph knew Michael better than that. The man wouldn't have left without his grandmother's silver rosary still hanging beside his bed, wouldn't have walked into the teeth of a blizzard without so much as a cloak. Joseph questioned it, quietly at first, but when he pressed Father Walsh for an explanation, the punishment was immediate and brutal. 7 days in solitary confinement in the basement chapel, a place no student had ever willingly entered after dark. And that is where it began. In that cold, suffocating tomb of stone, Joseph bore witness to something no sane man would speak of. Every night, around the same hour, he heard the unmistakable sounds of wagons arriving. Heavy objects being dragged across frozen ground, low, guttural voices speaking a language he did not recognize. The same three figures, their shadows cast in flickering candlelight, laboring over bundles that moved. He saw them once, through a filthy basement window crusted with frost. Three men carrying what appeared to be a body, a long, limp shape wrapped in a dark cloth loaded into the back of a wagon as carefully as one might move a sacred relic. Joseph began to record what he could, scratching notes into the margins of his breviary, marking the times, the sounds, the voices, every disappearance, every sudden transfer, every contradiction in the official stories. And it was then, alone in that crypt of stone and shadow, that the pattern emerged. They weren't random vanishings. They were selections. And the criteria was darker than anyone outside those walls could imagine. By the spring of 1848, the official count of students at Sacred Heart Seminary had dropped from 12 to 9. The priests offered explanations for each absence, transfers to distant monasteries, sudden family illness, secret missionary assignments, always reasonable, always unverifiable, and always accompanied by a ritualized announcement from Father Walsh at morning mass, delivered with solemn gravity and crocodile tears. But Joseph Kennedy had begun to see the connective tissue beneath the lies. It wasn't just random students disappearing, it was the best, the brightest, or, disturbingly, the ones who demonstrated a particular resilience to fear, those who wouldn't break under the weight of shame and silence. The priests weren't culling the weak, they were removing the inconvenient. On April the 3rd, 1848, it happened again. Thomas Gallagher, a gentle, devout young man from Milwaukee, known for his unwavering faith and pure-hearted nature, was summoned to Father Walsh's office after evening prayers. The summons came through Dean Patrick O'Brien, a man whose honeyed words and cold eyes made the students' stomachs twist. That night, the seminary halls were thick with dread. Students in nearby rooms reported raised voices behind the office door. Not the angry disputes of student and teacher, but something darker: coercion, pleading, then silence. By dawn, Gallagher was gone. The next morning's story was carefully constructed. Father Walsh claimed Thomas had confessed to unclean thoughts, to moral unfitness, and had voluntarily departed in the night for a contemplative monastery in Wisconsin. But as always, the details betrayed the lie. Gallagher's few personal possessions remained untouched. His mother's hand-carved rosary lay neatly on his desk, his winter coat and traveling boots untouched in the wardrobe, his most treasured book, a family Bible in scray, bed in his mother's hand, left open to the same page he'd been reading the night before, and worst of all, an unfinished letter to his sister. The final line stopped mid-sentence. "I thank God for bringing me to this sacred place where I feel I am finally," and nothing more. The script was always the same. It was Heinrich Weber, Gallagher's closest friend, who broke the pattern of silence. He approached Joseph Kennedy late that night, face pale, voice trembling, and spoke the words no other student dared utter aloud. "They're not priests, Joseph." And for the first time, the veil between innocence and horror began to tear. That single whispered confession from Heinrich Weber shattered the unspoken pact of fear that had bound the remaining students. "They're not priests, Joseph." 6 words, 6 bullets through the paper-thin illusion of Sacred Heart's holy purpose. Heinrich was no fool. A stoic, broad-shouldered German whose father had risen from brewery laborer to foreman in Milwaukee, he carried the kind of quiet, stubborn defiance born from generations of survival. He'd kept his head down, performed his duties, swallowed his doubts, until Gallagher vanished. That night, while the other students feigned sleep, Heinrich crept into Joseph's room, his face drawn, his eyes bloodshot from withheld tears. "I saw them," he whispered, loading something into the wagon. And then the dam broke. One by one, fragments of forbidden knowledge tumbled from Heinrich's memory. The night Brennan disappeared, how he'd heard muffled weeping, the unfamiliar prayers at Vespers, the oddity of the seminary's altar, how it wasn't centered before the crucifix, but directly above an ancient stone circle in the chapel floor, marked with worn, pagan sigils no church would sanction. But it wasn't just what Heinrich had seen, it was what he hadn't. In 15 months, not one of the 3 priests had ever received visitors from the diocese. No traveling bishops, no letters bearing the Vatican's sigil, no inspections, no inquiries, no ordinations, and in a church obsessed with hierarchy and oversight, that was unheard of. Joseph and Heinrich realized they'd been given different explanations for the same disappearances. The false priests tailored lies to each student based on what they were most likely to believe. For pious Thomas Morrison, tales of spiritual retreats. For ambitious Patrick Kelly, rumors of disciplinary disgrace. For fearful Antoine Dubois, threats of damnation and possession. They were isolating among them, not by chance, by design. And then, in hushed, uneven Latin, Heinrich recited a phrase he'd overheard during one of the midnight wagon arrivals. "Sanguinem sumentes proportis inferni," taking blood for the gates of hell. The words chilled Joseph to his marrow, not because of their literal meaning, but because the phrase wasn't part of any Catholic liturgy, nor any known Latin invocation. He recognized it from a passage in the Liber Somniorum Inferni, glimpsed once in the forbidden section of the seminary's locked library. They weren't just murdering students, they were feeding something. After that night, nothing about Sacred Heart Seminary looked the same to Joseph Kennedy. Every shadow seemed to lean a little too long. Every flickering candle threw shapes on the wall that didn't belong. And most disturbingly, the 3 priests, Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien no longer spoke like men of God. They spoke like jailers, like predators. The facade of piety crumbled in small, sinister ways. Walsh's sermons grew darker, dwelling obsessively on blood, sacrifice, and the ancient punishments of apostates. Murphy's lessons on canon law twisted toward obscure medieval tortures prescribed for heresy. And O'Brien stopped teaching altogether, retreating into the seminary's forbidden West Wing, a place no student was permitted to enter. And yet, on certain nights, light would flicker beneath that heavy oak door, and the scent of burning herbs and something far fouler would seep beneath the threshold. Joseph and Heinrich began a desperate, dangerous search for answers. The seminary's official archives were locked, its library catalogue incomplete, but buried deep in the dust-choked upper levels of the bell tower, they discovered a cache of discarded ledgers and student records dating back decades, pages torn, names scratched out, but enough remained to piece together a horrifying pattern. The Sacred Heart Seminary had opened in 1845 with 23 students. By 1850, only 9 names could still be traced. The rest simply vanished, each year's official count falsified, and most damning of all, among the earliest records was a single page from the original staff roster. 3 priests listed as murdered in 1847. Father Superior Edmund Walsh, Rector Thomas Murphy, Dean Patrick O'Brien. Their corpses discovered in the seminary's wine cellar, throats slit. Notes in the margin mentioned secular Irish vagrants arrested escaped before trial. The case had been closed by the local magistrate, but the names of the murderers, had never been recorded. Somehow those same names reappeared in the following year's staff register, as if the dead had risen, or more plausibly, as Joseph now understood, the killers had assumed the identities of the men they'd slaughtered. It wasn't a seminary anymore. It was a mask, a hunting ground. And beneath it, something ancient and unspeakable was stirring. Joseph Kennedy was no longer a student. Not in any sense that mattered. He'd crossed an invisible threshold, from pupil to witness, from believer to heretic. In the eyes of Sacred Heart's false priests, he had seen too much. He knew it the morning after finding the ledgers. During breakfast, Father Walsh's gaze lingered on him too long, a slow, cold smile curling beneath that silver beard. Murphy's sermon on the virtue of obedience became a thinly veiled threat. O'Brien's absence from morning prayers was no accident. It was preparation. Joseph confided in only one man, Heinrich Weber. The plan was desperate, but it was all they had. Escape, not through the main road, always watched, not by pleading to local authorities. Half the town of Milfield owed the seminary its livelihood, and would sooner bury a body than question the priests. There was an old maintenance tunnel beneath the east wing. Heinrich had discovered it months before, while retrieving firewood. A narrow stone passage leading beneath the chapel, out to the tree line at the edge of the prairie. They would leave after nightfall, take only what they could carry, reach Springfield, speak to the bishop, expose the horror. But evil rarely allows itself to be undone so easily. That evening, as they prepared to slip away, Joseph noticed something chilling. The seminary was too quiet. No prayers, no bells, no footsteps echoing through the high vaulted corridors. The halls stretched silent, thick with a suffocating sense of being watched. And then the bells tolled. Not the solemn call to Compline prayers, but a frantic, discordant peal that rattled the windows. The sound had no place in Catholic ritual. It was a signal. The hunt had begun. Joseph and Heinrich sprinted for the maintenance stairwell, hearts pounding, breath ragged, but as they rounded the corner to the cellar door, it was already open. Standing there, cloaked in flickering candlelight, was Father O'Brien. His face, once smooth and youthful, now gaunt, his skin pulled tight over sharp cheekbones, his eyes burned with a fevered light, and in his hand, a long, curved ritual blade, older than any church relic. "You shouldn't have looked, boys," he whispered, voice thick with inhuman resonance, "but since you have, you'll serve a higher altar tonight." And behind him the shadows moved. The moment froze, thick with the copper tang of candle smoke and something far fouler. Joseph could feel his pulse thundering in his throat, the primal terror of a hunted animal cornered by something older and hungrier than mere men. O'Brien's smile was wrong. Too wide, teeth too white in the gloom, and in the shifting flicker of light, the ritual blade seemed almost to drink the shadows. But it was Heinrich who moved first. With a guttural roar that sounded more beast than man, Heinrich drove his shoulder into O'Brien's chest, slamming him backwards into the cellar doorframe. The impact sent the blade clattering to the stone floor, the sharp ring of metal on rock like a signal flare in the oppressive silence. "Run!" Heinrich shouted, his voice ragged, defiant. Joseph bolted down the corridor, feet pounding the ancient stones, but he could hear the others coming. The wet slap of footsteps in bare feet, multiple figures pouring from the chapel's secret passages, some chanting in guttural, broken Latin. The words twisted, unnatural. Not a prayer, but a summons. And then, a sound no human throat should make. A low, wet, animalistic croak from deep in the shadows. A thing wearing human skin, or what was left of it. As Joseph reached the maintenance tunnel entrance, he risked one last glance behind him. He saw Heinrich still grappling with O'Brien, blood streaming from a gash above his eye, but it was Murphy and Walsh who truly chilled his blood. They stood together at the top of the stairs, both now stripped of their priestly robes, revealing strange ritual garb beneath. Symbols inked in rust-colored stains, pagan marks mixed with sigils Joseph recognized from the forbidden grimoires in the locked library. Not Catholic, not Christian. Older. Murphy held a ceremonial staff topped with a grotesque carving, half goat, half human, its eyes set with fragments of black. Glass that seemed to pulse with malevolent light. Walsh's hands were slick with blood, fresh, and in his grasp hung a chain of human teeth strung on rawhide. "Bring him to the stone," Walsh intoned, his voice no longer that of a priest, but something ancient, cracked and inhuman. "The offering must not escape." And then the candle flames guttered, not from wind, but as if recoiling from what stood behind them. Joseph fled into the tunnel, and the earth itself seemed to shudder. The maintenance tunnel was no salvation. It wasn't a passage meant for escape. It was a channel, a vein cut into the earth, leading not away from darkness, but deeper into it. Joseph realized this too late, the cold, wet stones pressing in around him as the flickering light of his stolen lantern threw maddening shapes on the walls. The tunnel stank of old blood and damp earth, and something else. A scent so ancient and wrong it clung to his tongue, like burnt marrow and sweet rotting herbs. The walls weren't simply stone. Here and there carvings marked the passage, crude figures of horned men, circles within circles, runes that pulsed faintly in the lantern's glow. Joseph forced himself forward, his breath ragged in the stale air. Above him, he could hear faint sounds through the packed soil, the scrape of heavy furniture. A low, continuous chant, voices raised in a language older than Latin, and beneath it all, a rhythm, a heartbeat, not human, slow, immense. It wasn't coming from the chapel above, it was coming from below. A terrible realization dawned on him. Sacred Heart Seminary wasn't built on holy ground. It was constructed atop something ancient, something buried, and every vanished student, every blood offering, every midnight wagon had fed it. He rounded a bend in the passage and the floor sloped sharply downward. The temperature dropped, his breath misting in the lantern light. And then he saw it. An ancient stone doorway, half collapsed, inscribed with glyphs no Catholic scholar could translate. Beyond it, a black chamber so vast it seemed to swallow the flickering light. In its center stood an altar of bone, not metaphorical bone, real human femurs, ribs and vertebrae, stacked and fused with some tar-like substance, and on the altar, a figure, a boy, unmoving, his face slack, eyes wide with terror, throat slit so deeply his head lolled at an unnatural angle. Thomas Gallagher. He hadn't left for any monastery. Joseph gagged, bile rising in his throat, but it was what lay behind the altar that shattered what remained of his sanity. A shape, coiled, immense. Neither flesh nor shadow, but something in between. Its form was impossible to fix. A writhing, pulsing mass of limbs and faces and eyes, all shifting in and out of one another. And at its center, a maw. Smiling. Waiting. There are moments in a man's life when the mind, out of mercy or madness, refuses to comprehend what the eyes witness. Joseph Kennedy stood on the threshold of that moment now. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to run, to claw his way back up the tunnel, to let the darkness take this place and forget it ever existed. But something held him. Not courage, not faith. A terrible primal recognition. He knew this thing, not its name, not its form, but its presence. The same presence that ancient men felt huddled around fires in the primal dark. The one that whispered from ancient forests, that demanded blood from hilltop altars long before men built churches. It had never left. The church had merely buried it, and Sacred Heart had been built to keep it fed. The monstrous, writhing form pulsed in the gloom. Its countless eyes turned to Joseph at once, eyes human and inhuman, familiar faces distorted, some belonging to the vanished students, their mouths still mouthing silent screams, faces of the priests, of Heinrich. Joseph's knees buckled. The lantern fell from his grasp, shattering against the stone floor. The chamber plunged into thick, suffocating darkness, pierced only by the unholy glow radiating from the altar itself. The rhythmic heartbeat, if heartbeat it was, thundered in his ears. And then, a voice. Not spoken, not heard. It moved inside his skull, wrapping around his thoughts, filling every corner of his consciousness. You see, and seeing, you are mine. The words were a weight, a brand burned into the meat of his mind. Every instinct, every memory, every prayer Joseph had ever uttered recoiled in that moment. His limbs refused to obey him, and behind him, the priests. Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien stepped from the shadows, their bodies slick with blood, their faces no longer human masks but pale, grinning things, stretched, wrong, their eyes black as coal. Your blood, Walsh intoned, will open the gate. The old one wakes. The harvest begins. They advanced, chanting, arms raised, holding gleaming, ancient blades. But in that instant, as the thing in the darkness reached for him, as the voices pressed closer, Joseph did something none of them expected. He spoke. A single word. A name. And the room recoiled. The word Joseph spoke wasn't Latin, it wasn't the name of any saint, nor a plea to the Christian God whose emblem hung, tarnished and impotent, on the blood-stained walls of Sacred Heart. It was older, a word he should never have known. And yet, in the cracked, crumbling margins of a forbidden grimoire he'd once glimpsed in the seminary library's restricted section, buried beneath layers of fabricated theology, it had waited. A name not to be prayed to, but commanded. Zethra. The moment it left his lips, the chamber changed. The heartbeat faltered, stuttered. The massive, writhing shape at the room's center drew back as if struck. Its endless faces contorted in something Joseph could only describe as recognition and rage. The priests froze. Walsh's face twisted in fury. How do you know that name, boy? But Joseph wasn't listening. The name had cost him something. He could feel it. A piece of his mind seared away, a memory of sunlight on his mother's porch, of laughter, of anything innocent, was gone now. Traded for this ancient word of command. The writhing mass let out a sound not meant for human ears, a shriek that made the ancient stone tremble and Joseph's bones ache. And in the wake of that sound, the chamber itself began to collapse. Walls shuddered, ancient supports cracked, centuries of earth above them threatening to fall. And from the crumbling passages beyond the altar, shapes poured forth. Not men, not animals, things that had once been both. Twisted, hybrid abominations, hairless, eyeless, some with limbs bent at impossible angles, some dragging the remnants of priestly garb behind them. The lost students, but not lost. changed. Their hollow eyes turned to Joseph, recognition flickering like guttering candle flames, and then, as one, they turned upon the priests. What followed was neither battle nor slaughter, but a reckoning. Al screamed as a dozen clawed hands dragged him toward the altar. Murphy tried to flee, but the earth beneath his feet split, swallowing him whole. O'Brien's last words were lost beneath a mass of teeth and bone. The ancient beast howled as its keepers were consumed by their own crimes. Joseph stumbled backward, the world collapsing, the ceiling groaning, and in the chaos, a single thought echoed through his mind. You were never meant to survive this. Not figuratively. The very soil around Joseph trembled with an unholy resonance, a deep, bone-humming groan that seemed to radiate from some monstrous depth far beneath Sacred Heart's foundations. Ancient timbers cracked, stone supports gave way, and a thick, choking dust filled the collapsing chamber. Joseph staggered forward, half blind, half mad, driven by nothing more than the primal instinct to live. The thing at the heart of this ancient blasphemy writhed in agony, its shifting, monstrous form collapsing inward as though recoiling from the word Joseph had spoken. Its faces shrieked in unison. Dozens, maybe hundreds of human visages stretched and distorted by horror and betrayal. And through the swirling gloom, Joseph saw them. The students. But they weren't lost anymore. Not entirely. The wretched, malformed things that had moments ago ripped the false priests apart now stood, faces slack, eyes vacant. But something flickered behind their gaze. A glimmer of memory. A ghost of who they had been. Michael Brennan's torn face twisted upward toward Joseph, and for a breath, recognition passed between them. A fragment of a soul. Joseph reached out, his fingers brushing the ragged, ruined hand of his once brother in faith. In that single, electric instant of contact, a flood of memory and sorrow surged through Joseph's mind. Faces, names, lives stolen, dreams betrayed. 27 men, taken under the guise of holy purpose, their youth consumed as blood tithed to something ancient and terrible. And in that moment, something shifted. The monstrous thing howled again, its mass beginning to collapse, the chamber quaking violently. The students, or what remained of them, turned away from Joseph as one, their mutilated bodies shambling toward the writhing horror. Wordlessly, they flung themselves into it one after another, their bodies vanishing into the heaving maw of darkness. And as the last broken form was consumed, the beast screamed, not in triumph, but in defeat. The ancient stone cracked, and a gout of blood-dark mist belched upward, the very earth groaning as if rejecting the thing that had been buried within it for centuries. Joseph fell to his knees, every fiber of his being scorched raw, and then a silence so absolute it rang in his ears. Somewhere above him, dawn broke. But Sacred Heart Seminary would never see another sunrise. The aftermath was a silence so total, so oppressive, it felt unnatural. Joseph Kennedy knelt in the rubble, his body trembling, lungs burning from dust and smoke. The horror of the last hours, or was it days, pressed against the edges of his sanity like a storm surge against a crumbling levee. He should have died. By all rights, whatever ancient covenant bound this place should have claimed him too. Yet he remained. And it wasn't mercy. It was purpose. The tunnel behind him had collapsed, the great altar shattered into jagged shards of bone and stone. The writhing mass was gone, consumed, banished, buried again. But something of it lingered, a sickness in the air, a taint in the marrow of the earth. Sacred Heart Seminary was no longer a house of God. It never had been. Joseph rose unsteadily to his feet, the single word still etched into his consciousness. Azethra. It burned like a brand on his mind. He didn't know what it meant, not truly. Only that speaking it had cost him a piece of his soul, and that some part of the thing in the earth had recognized it. In the distance, through the broken walls of the seminary above, the first light of dawn bled into the horizon. The world would wake soon. Townspeople would come. And the church, ever the master of illusion, would find its convenient explanations. A fire, a structural collapse, An outbreak of madness. The truth would be buried, sealed beneath layers of scripture, bureaucracy, and the careful lies of men trained to maintain the sacred narrative. Joseph knew this, knew that by surviving he had become a threat to that carefully guarded silence. And still, he climbed. Hand over hand, pulling himself through the shattered foundations, through the blood-stained chapel, past the cold corpses of priests who had never truly been priests. He emerged into the crisp dawn air, lungs filling with the scent of frost, MP grass and smouldering wood. The world outside remained oblivious. The church bell tower still stood, its bronze mouth silent. The distant town of Milfield slept peacefully, unaware that within a mile of their homes, a centuries-old blasphemy had nearly consumed them all. Joseph Kennedy did not pray. He turned toward the road, toward whatever waited beyond the horizon, carrying with him a story that no man was meant to tell. And yet someone had to. The story should have ended there. A shattered seminary, a lone survivor staggering into the dawn, and the silence of a church eager to erase the evidence of its darkest sins. That's how these things usually end. Blood is washed away, the earth is consecrated, and history is quietly rewritten by those whose power depends on forgetting. But Sacred Heart refused to stay buried. In the weeks following the collapse, Vatican agents arrived under the cover of night, men in black cassocks, their faces lined with years of harsh penance and even harsher deeds. These were not priests in any traditional sense. They were fixers, inquisitors, members of an ancient clerical order whose name was never written down, only spoken in dead languages by those who feared them. They sealed the site. To the townspeople, the explanation was simple: a structural fire, likely sparked by faulty gas lines. The seminary had long been a financial burden, they said. Its collapse, while tragic, was inevitable. The bishop in Chicago issued carefully worded condolences. Families of the missing students received letters penned in flowing ecclesiastical Latin, expressing sorrow while subtly discouraging further inquiry. But some inquiries refused to die. Within months, strange accidents befell anyone who dared question the official story. The editor of the Milfield Gazette was found drowned in a shallow well behind his office. A local carpenter who claimed to have seen something not meant for daylight during the cleanup vanished, his tools left behind as if he'd simply stepped out of existence. And then there was Joseph Kennedy. He did not return to Chicago. He did not return home. For 2 years there was no record of his whereabouts, no letters, no sightings. Until a single page, brittle, water-damaged, and reeking of old blood, arrived at a Jesuit archive in Boston. Written in a trembling, unrecognizable hand, it bore only 3 lines. They will bury the truth. The old ones are not dead. I have seen the threshold, and it stares back. There was no signature. The Vatican declared it a hoax, a prank by anti-clerical dissidents. The page was quietly filed in the Archivum Secretum, the forbidden vault where the church hides the stories it dares not burn. But some read it, and some remembered. And among those who did, doors long sealed began to creak open once more. They called it the Quiet Harvest. An unspoken ritual, older than the church, older than Rome itself. Whispers of it can be found scattered through forbidden texts, encoded in the margins of medieval grimoires, or buried beneath the floorboards of crumbling monasteries where no one dares look too closely. A practice designed not to honor the divine, but to feed something else. 27 young men, each chosen, not at random, but according to precise, ancient criteria, bloodlines traced back to particular clans in County Kerry and Connaught, to families who, centuries ago, were custodians of stone circles and midnight rites long before Patrick brought his brittle cross to the Emerald Isle. The priests at Sacred Heart weren't imposters, they were successors. Guardians of an old pact made when Ireland bled under Roman swords and the Druids were driven into shadow. A pact that promised protection for their line in exchange for the occasional offering of flesh and spirit. Chosen sons, given to the earth, to a thing buried deeper than roots, older than gods. When Ireland starved during the Great Famine and its sons fled across the sea, those old allegiances came too. The ancient rites demanded continuity, and so, in the New World, new stones were raised, new circles formed beneath churches and seminaries, hiding their old hunger beneath the thin veneer of Christianity. Sacred Heart wasn't an accident. It was built by design. Every architectural choice, every stone, every artifact imported from the old country, even the placement of the chapel over the sinkhole that led to the burial chamber, followed ritual specifications. The seminary's bell tower marked the northern point of a precisely calculated leyline grid stretching across the Illinois prairie, intersecting with other ancient sites long forgotten by history. And every 27 years, the blood cycle closed. The students weren't taken for ransom, not for labor, not for sport. They were offerings. Their lives, their potential, their very souls fed into the churning, unseen mechanism that keeps certain ancient forces sleeping, or at least distracted, forces the Church, for all its public piety, has long known how to placate, and feared what would happen if it did not. And it wasn't just Illinois. It was everywhere. The United States was never meant to be a Christian nation. That's the lie they sold you in school. Carefully worded declarations about freedom of religion, lofty quotes from founding fathers scrubbed of context, cherry-picked to paint the image of a nation under God. But beneath the surface, beneath the marble domes and stained glass sanctuaries, something older took root. The old blood cults didn't die in Europe. They migrated. The Puritans, with their obsession for witches and hidden sin, carried the old dread with them. The Masons etched it into their cornerstones. The Catholic orders, Jesuits, Benedictines, Franciscans, adapted ancient rites to Christian trappings, hiding druidic sacrifices beneath rituals of penance and ascension. And nowhere was this more deeply woven than in the prairies of the American Midwest. The ley lines crossing Illinois, Missouri, and Indiana mark some of the most powerfully charged spiritual intersections on the continent. Forgotten native burial grounds, ancient stone altars, and earthworks raised by settlers who never fully understood what they were destroying. The energies remained, restless and hungry, long after the bodies were dust. This was why Sacred Heart Seminary was founded where it was. The Vatican's architects weren't interested in the picturesque hills or fertile land. They were drawn to the thinness of the veil there, the boundary between the seen and the unseen, a place where old things whispered through the roots of oak trees and the wind carried voices in tongues long dead. Joseph Kennedy wasn't the first to discover it. Old farmers' journals, yellowed and brittle, spoke of strange lights over the seminary grounds, of mutilated livestock arranged in ritualistic patterns, of children vanishing from nearby homesteads every 27 years, their names carefully struck from census records by men in stiff collars and gold rings. And through it all, a single symbol appeared again and again, an inverted triskel, 3 interlocked spirals encircled by a ring of thorns. It wasn't a Christian symbol. It was older than Christ, older than Rome, older than history itself. And even now, etched into the stones beneath the crumbled ruins of Sacred Heart, long after the last bell tolled, it waits. Because such things are never truly destroyed, only delayed. By the autumn of 1863, long after Sacred Heart had been officially abandoned and its ruins swallowed by prairie grass, a new seminary rose in Missouri, St. Ignatius of the Shadows. On the surface, it appeared like any other frontier religious institution, stone chapel, modest dormitories, a bell tower that reached for God. But to those who could read the signs, those who understood what the placement of windows meant, the arrangement of graves in the surrounding cemetery, the careful orientation of the altar to match solstice alignments, it was unmistakably a continuation. The cycle had begun again. The church, you see, doesn't bury its mistakes, it transplants them. Just as Rome built its cathedrals over pagan temples, claiming to consecrate the old world while quietly absorbing its power, so too did the Vatican relocate the rites of Sacred Heart. The order tasked with overseeing this transition was known only by an ancient term, custodes umbrae, the keepers of the shadow. They were priests, yes, but also surgeons, interrogators, and architects of spiritual manipulation. Their job was not to save souls, but to bind them, and they learned from the failures at Sacred Heart, where before the offerings had been taken from within their own walls, raising suspicion, inviting the risk of witnesses, the new order adapted. Now the children came from orphanages, from immigrant camps, from the nameless and the displaced, whose disappearances no one would question. Every 27 years, and as the American frontier pushed west, so too did these dark sanctuaries in Kansas, in Colorado, in the Black Hills, each built with precision, each connected by the same invisible grid of ley lines stretching from the old world into the new. And beneath them, the same thing slept, waiting. Because that's the deeper horror they never told you, that the ancient gods of blood and Sigitabuan tone were never destroyed, they were merely renamed, assimilated, and in the secret cathedrals of power from Rome to Washington, their rites continue in forms you'd never recognize: a missing boy, a vanished woman, a town's history quietly edited, always 27 years, always a harvest, and every time, fewer remain who remember. There's a reason you've never heard of Sacred Heart Seminary. It isn't because records were lost. It isn't because of some innocent fire or a town too small to warrant attention. No, you've never heard of it because powerful men made certain you wouldn't, and they didn't just erase names from documents, they erased bloodlines, entire family histories blotted out like spilled ink on sacred vellum. And here's the truth most men can't stomach. The world you live in isn't random, it's engineered. Every cathedral, every university seal, every fraternal lodge insignia carries marks left by those ancient blood cults, symbols passed down through centuries like a code spoken in architecture and ritual. And if you know how to look, it's everywhere. Why do you think so many of these old religious schools, seminaries and churches are built atop fault lines, near river convergences, or at the highest point in a town? Why the precise timing of their dedications aligned with eclipses or ancient feast days masked as Christian holidays? It was never about faith. It was about energy. Human emotion, fear, devotion, despair, ecstasy is a currency, and blood is the medium through which ancient agreements are paid. The so-called saints and martyrs they taught you to venerate, many of them were victims of these rites, their deaths ritualized and sanitized for public consumption. And Sacred Heart, it was merely a node in a vast network. That inverted Triskel symbol, it appears carved into stone lintels at ancient monasteries in Ireland, scratched into tree bark in Appalachian forests, hidden in the corner of colonial gravestones in New England. Even today it appears in state seals, military insignias, and the logos of global institutions you'd swear had no connection to one another. But they do, because those who ruled in blood 3,000 years ago never vanished. They just changed their names, changed their clothes, learned to write policy instead of curses, but the rituals remained, and every 27 years the harvest comes due, and if you think it's over, if you think this is a story about the past, you've already fallen into the trap. Because it's still happening. Right now, somewhere near you. There's a phrase the old priests used to whisper when they thought no one could hear them. Non omnes mortui dormiunt. Not all the dead sleep. It wasn't a metaphor. The rites performed at Sacred Heart, and later at St. Ignatius and dozens of other hidden sites, weren't mere sacrifices. They were binding rituals, designed to trap the essence of the offerings within the earth itself, beneath consecrated ground bound by sigils and ancient words older than Latin. And those trapped souls didn't rest. The legend of haunted cemeteries, restless spirits, strange lights in old churchyards, it all ties back to these rituals, places where the veil between life and death was deliberately torn thin, where spiritual energy could be harvested, manipulated, and weaponized. And in the ruins of Sacred Heart Seminary, those old bindings began to fail. By the early 20th century, local farmers spoke of strange figures moving through the ruins at night, half-seen shapes in clerical robes, the smell of incense where no living man had walked in decades, and always the bell tower, its bell long removed, yet some nights it was heard tolling at midnight, each toll a summons, each toll a claim, and those who answered, disappeared. Between 1901 and 1928, 7 people vanished within a mile radius of the ruins. A traveling tinker, 2 farmhands, a sheriff's deputy, a pair of orphan boys from the county home, a young schoolteacher whose last journal entry described a man in robes with no eyes. The county quietly declared the area cursed. The ruins were fenced off, the land sold to a lumber consortium with Vatican ties, who made sure no one built there again. But even in death, the old custodians kept vigil. Because to them, those 27 vanished priests were more than flesh. They were anchors, human seals binding something vast and ancient beneath the Illinois soil. And when sea bindings weakened, the harvest cycle resumed, not by accident, not by desperate men, but by design, to reset the seal, to keep it sleeping, because the alternative is worse. But here's the part no one tells you. It was never just about the priests. It was about the bloodlines they carried. The 27 young men taken from Sacred Heart weren't chosen for their piety or theological promise. They were selected because of what flowed through their veins. Ancient blood connected by invisible threads stretching back to the old pagan dynasties of Ireland, before the Romans, before the Christians, before recorded time. Men whose ancestors once stood in stone circles under a harvest moon, chanting names long since stripped from human language, names not meant for mortal tongues. The old cults believed, and still believe, that blood remembers, that certain lines retain fragments of ancestral memory, spiritual potency passed from generation to generation, a kind of living key. And those 27 priests weren't sacrifices in the traditional sense. They were offerings of access, each death unlocking a different aspect of the seal buried beneath the seminary grounds, each soul fueling a rite older than Egypt, meant to placate or imprison something beneath the earth, a slumbering thing whose name even the Vatican won't speak aloud in its darkest catacombs. That's why, when those boys vanished, there were no investigations, no patrols, no bloodhounds, no city council meetings, because the right people already knew. The bishops, the landowners, the masons, the old families, those whose coats of arms still bear strange symbols, half faded from age, quartered shields etched with wolves, stags, or thorns, each a marker of ancestral allegiance. And here's where it turns. Some of those bloodlines survived. Not all 27 vanished forever. Rumors persisted of escapees, of survivors who faked death, slipped into the night and carried with them terrible knowledge. Men who lived as outcasts, mad prophets in mining towns, hermits in the Appalachia and hollows, old men with strange eyes and worse stories. And they left behind descendants. Bloodlines scattered through America's heartland, East Coast and Deep South. Men and women today who have no idea what sleeps in their DNA. And if you're still here, if you're still listening, it might be you. There's a reason blood matters. You've been told your entire life that history is written in books, in battles, in treaties signed by dead men under flickering candlelight. But the truth they fear you'll grasp, is that history is written in bloodlines, in families, in the careful, strategic breeding of certain traits, instincts, and spiritual susceptibilities. This isn't eugenics. It's older. It's what the ancient Celts called anamnesis, blood memory. A line can forget for a generation. It can wander, fall into poverty, ignorance, obscurity. But eventually something reawakens. Some flicker of the old knowledge surfaces in a child's dreams. A symbol drawn without knowing why. A word spoken in sleep. A primal instinct to avoid a certain place, a certain name, a certain church. The Vatican learned this centuries ago. That's why they didn't just eliminate the 27 priests. They charted their bloodlines, hunting down brothers, cousins, nephews. Records from 1870 show priests dispatched to distant villages with sealed orders. Baptisms, marriages, even illnesses were used as pretexts for surveillance. And every so often, removal. But they missed some. Because no system is perfect. Because fate, or something older, has a way of slipping knives past the strongest armor. And it's those surviving bloodlines that began to trouble them in the early 20th century, reports of strange dreams among descendants, drawings of the inverted triskel scrawled in schoolbooks, children speaking in dead dialects of Gaelic. A boy in Kentucky who, at 6 years old, recited an incantation last spoken by Druids in 300 BC. A girl in Kansas who instinctively knew the burial rites for an ancient god whose name no Christian priest would dare utter. And so the church did what it's always done. They sent new custodes, not robed priests, not monks, but modern men, doctors, government officials, FBI agents assigned to obscure departments, men who could access hospital records, census data, birth certificates, men trained not in confessionals, but in quiet disappearances. Because if those bloodlines awaken fully, if those descendants remember what their ancestors knew, the ancient bindings weaken. And if you're still watching this video, hearing these words, it means they've failed. There's something about forgotten places, the old seminaries, abandoned churches, crumbling rectories swallowed by weeds and vines. You pass them on rural highways or tucked behind modern developments, their bell towers cracked, windows boarded, stained glass shattered like the bones of a long-dead saint. But they aren't empty, not in the way you've been told. In America alone, over 140 Catholic seminaries were quietly decommissioned, defunded, or burned between 1870 and 1920. Officially, it was due to financial hardship, dwindling enrollment, or anti-Catholic sentiment, but unofficially, they were sealing the doors. After Sacred Heart fell, patterns emerged, disappearances, strange outbreaks, sudden renunciations of faith by promising priests, entire orders quietly relocated to remote regions, and beneath each abandoned seminary lay something deeper, not metaphorically, but literally. Caverns. Stone tunnels cut by hand centuries before Europeans arrived, chambers lined with symbols no known Catholic order ever used, bones arranged deliberately, circles of rusted iron, and in the center, a stone slab. Every single one. No official record explains who built them, why they exist, or how the church acquired them, but oral tradition among rural Catholics whispered one word: vaults. Places where things too dangerous to destroy and too ancient to comprehend were hidden. Artifacts, writings, the remains of things best left unspoken, and in the blood-soaked wake of Sacred Heart, those vaults became active again. In 1911, a team of Jesuit archaeologists, men handpicked by the Vatican, entered the ruins. Their mission was to locate the vault beneath the seminary and reseal it permanently. Only 3 returned. The official report listed cave-ins. Locals claimed they heard screaming beneath the earth for 3 nights. Those 3 survivors were never seen in public again. Assigned to secluded monasteries in Sicily, the Isle of Man, and rural Quebec, where they lived out their days in silence. But one of them left a journal. A ragged, half-burned diary later found in the belongings of a deceased Vatican courier in 1936. In it, he described what lay in that vault. Not a demon, not a relic, but a voice, an ancient thing that spoke in hunger and promise. A voice they couldn't kill, only feed, every generation. And somewhere near you, another vault still waits. You've heard the phrase, the devil is in the details, but what they never told you is, it wasn't metaphor. The old church, long before it became the polished marble institution you see today, was a terrified, desperate organization, not battling heresy, not protecting morality, but trying to contain ancient forces they barely understood. And at the heart of it all were the agreements. In the Vatican's hidden archive, the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, buried beneath 53 miles of shelving, there exist documents older than the church itself, carried over from fallen empires, from the Druidic orders, from Roman blood cults. Documents of covenant, pacts struck between ancient entities and human intermediaries, agreements forged in sacrifice and sealed in blood, stipulating what must be given to maintain cosmic balance. The church didn't obliterate those pacts. They inherited them, adapted them, changed the names of the old gods to saints, turned fertility rites into feast days, and rebranded blood sacrifice as martyrdom. And Sacred Heart Seminary wasn't an anomaly. It was a node. One of 7 binding points scattered across North America, each one strategically placed along ancient ley lines, fault zones where the veil between this world and the next runs thin. 7 points to hold the thing beneath in check, a thing whose name was once spoken only by those who sought madness. The other 6, St. Ignatius in Vermont, Our Lady of Mercy in southern Louisiana, the Jesuit College of St. Bartholomew in rural Quebec, St. Catherine's Abbey in Utah, San Miguel Mission in New Mexico, and the ruins of Fort Sable in Michigan, each one a place where disappearances, strange fires, and whispered curses haunt local history, all of them surrounded by churches, convents, or Catholic hospitals to maintain proximity. And here's the truth. Every 77 years, a blood offering is required at each site. Not just any blood, but from certain lines, the 27 at Sacred Heart, the lost nuns of St. Ignatius, the vanished missionaries in the desert. Each disappearance part of a silent ritual chain. And the next cycle, it's begun. Watch the news, count the vanishings, look for names you'll never hear twice. They're moving again, and if you've watched this far, you already feel it in your bones. By now you've probably felt it. A kind of pressure, like something ancient leaning closer, reading over your shoulder. That's not paranoia, it's recognition. Because here's what they never admit. Once you hear certain names, once your mind assembles certain patterns, you change. Not metaphorically, biologically, spiritually. You become visible to things that operate outside the neat clockwork of ordinary life. In ancient times, the Druids called it the awakening of the sight, the ability to sense not just what's in front of you, but what stands behind it. The figure at the corner of the room when no one's home, the faint scrape of nails on old wood, the recurring number that haunts your clock, the name you see twice in one day on 2 different gravestones. And this video, it's your trial, because no man reaches this point by accident. The algorithm didn't bring you here, fate did. An old law, older than the internet, older than Christendom, older than written language, the ancient belief that knowledge seeks out its own. And those 27 priests, they weren't just offerings. They were initiates, chosen not to die but to be transformed in death. Their spirits shackled to the 7 nodes, becoming watchmen, sentinels who whisper warnings to bloodline descendants who stray too close to the forbidden paths. You'll start seeing them soon, not in dreams, in reflections, in the moment between turning off the light and sleep, in old photographs where a figure stands at the edge of a crowd, expressionless, eyes fixed on the lens. One of them might wear your face, because bloodlines don't skip forever, and the line of watchers must replenish. This is where your role changes. If you've followed this far, drop this phrase twice in the comments right now. I claim the forgotten name. I claim the forgotten name. It's not a gimmick. It marks you. To this Chan, L to those who see beyond the veil, and it signals to the old blood that another has heard. Do it now. And remember, once a name is claimed, it cannot be unspoken. There's a lie modernity tells, that darkness belongs to the past, that ancient horrors, secret rites, vanished men, those were symptoms of a primitive, superstitious world. That now we're clean, safe, rational. You feel it, don't you? The unease at how perfectly convenient that lie is, because in every age, the machinery adapts. In the days of Sacred Heart, it wore cassocks and spoke in Latin. Now it speaks in corporate jargon, dresses in tailored suits. It funds research initiatives. It builds hospitals and mental health centers under saintly names while routing the old bloodlines into quiet, locked wards where no one asks why half the patients share surnames found in 19th century missing persons ledgers. The vaults still exist, but now they're beneath parking structures, corporate campuses, government archives labeled records not for public access. And the ancient agreements? They were never broken. They were updated. In 1963, a series of meetings took place at a now demolished Jesuit retreat in upstate New York. On paper, it was a theological symposium on the ethics of faith in the atomic age. But in truth, it was a renegotiation. The old gods weren't banished by nuclear fire. If anything, they were fed. The Vatican, certain intelligence agencies, and the secret heads of a few bloodline families gathered to reallocate responsibility for the 7 nodes, to establish new cycles of sacrifice more discreet than vanished priests in rural towns, car accidents, industrial mishaps, private jet malfunctions, mass disappearances in national parks labeled as unexplained. The pattern never stopped. It evolved. Every 77 years, the wheel turns, and every time it does, a few awaken. A handful of men stumble upon the old names, the forbidden sites. A diary in a thrift store, a basement hidden beneath an abandoned church, a video, like this one. They never last long. The official story reads mental health crisis, missing person, or tragic accident. But you're still here. That means one of 2 things. You're meant to be the next watcher, or you're marked for removal. Either way, the old names already know you. Let's speak plainly now. There's something older than scripture, older than civilization. A presence that men have called 1,000 names. Azoth, the hunger, the voice beneath, the ash mother. The church didn't defeat it. They learned to coexist. And those 27 priests, they were born under signs, dates, bloodlines. Signs visible only to those trained to see them. Certain families in the 18th and 19th centuries bred children deliberately across regions and nations to produce candidates for the watchman's chain. Sacred Heart wasn't a school. It was a breeding house. The records you won't find in Vatican archives, but you will in old county registries, in faded baptismal ledgers, in the burial records of vanished towns, reveal a disturbing pattern. The same surnames appearing again and again at these sites of disappearance. Gallagher, Brennan, Muller, O'Shaughnessy, Weber. Some of those names might be in your own ancestry. And here's where it turns. Every generation, 1 or 2 of these marked bloodlines survives, not by accident, but by design, because the agreements require continuity. The ones who vanished weren't merely killed, they were transformed, bound to a lattice of places, times, and rites that even now pulse like a living map beneath this country's soil. When certain numbers align, specific dates, astronomical events, and blood sacrifices, the veil thins. The same as it did in 1848, the same as it did in 1925, in 2002, and soon again. You've seen it too, haven't you? Patterns you couldn't explain. The name you passed twice in one day, the same 3 numbers repeating on receipts, street signs, digital clocks. That's not coincidence. It's call and response. You've entered the old current now. And the old current remembers. There's a reason videos like this don't reach the masses, a reason why the algorithm buries them, why ancient structures invest billions to drown it in noise. But the current reaches those it must. And if you're hearing this, if you've felt your stomach tighten, your skin prickle, your eyes check the shadows without thinking, then the old current has found you, and it rarely lets go. Let's tear the veil completely. Do you know what the church feared most about Sacred Heart Seminary? It wasn't scandal, it wasn't the disappearances, it wasn't even the bloodlines. It was what those young men saw before they vanished. The accounts, buried in confiscated journals and half-burned correspondence, hint at something beyond human treachery, something not of this world, not of heaven, hell, or earth. In Joseph Kennedy's final journal entry, the one torn from the seminary's archives and later discovered hidden in the wall of an abandoned boarding house outside Springfield, he wrote one line, "They wear our faces now." Simple, chilling, and perfectly clear to those who know. The old ritual wasn't about killing, it was about replacement. Entities from beyond the threshold, unnameable things that slip through when the veil thins, cannot wear their true forms here. They require vessels. And young men, pure in bloodline, marked from birth. Those were ideal. The 27 didn't die. They were hollowed, emptied. What stepped into their skin returned to towns and parishes, took confessions, blessed marriages, buried children, and they built legacies. Men who went on to become bishops, financiers, military commanders. Men who vanished from history because the things wearing them abandoned human concerns. And here's where it turns sharp. The bloodline doesn't resist. It answers. That's why you've always felt it. That nagging sense of being watched. The unexplainable dreams, the repeated faces in crowds, the irrational primal fear of certain old churches and deep, dark woods. The old ones don't forget their own, and if you carry their mark, no distance, no faith, no name change can sever it. That's why knowledge like this was forbidden. Not because it was myth, because it was instruction. Now you see why certain families prosper while others vanish. Why some men die quiet, invisible deaths, while others disappear in ways no record survives. The system feeds itself, and by making it to Section 29, you've placed yourself on the map, not the one drawn in ink and names. The old map, and it's already moving toward you. There's a story they don't tell in the official records of Sacred Heart Seminary, because it survived not in books, but in blood. A lone witness, one man who escaped. His name was Declan Moore, born 1829, baptized under St. Bridget's name, descendant of the O'Connor line, a family with ancient ties to Druidic blood rites long before Rome ever set foot in Ireland. And that, perhaps, is why he was never meant to reach Sacred Heart. He arrived in the spring of 1849, brought by a letter from his dying uncle in Milwaukee, a late replacement for a seminarian who'd disappeared midwinter. Moore wasn't like the others. He carried the old ways, not Catholic, not Protestant, something older, whispered by his grandmother in Gaelic beneath a blackthorn tree. Within a month, he knew something was wrong. The endless curfews, the forbidden places, the strange marks carved into the beams of the basement chapel, older than Latin, older than Christ. And then came the night. Moore saw them. Not just the priests, but what they became after midnight. Journal fragments found decades later in the walls of an abandoned rectory in Bloomington tell of skin that rippled like water, faces collapsing into featureless masks before reforming, of voices layered with dozens, speaking in tongues older than Babylon. He wrote of a hidden chamber beneath the chapel floor, a pit lined with stones inscribed in Ogham, an alphabet dead for 1,000 years, and inside that pit, the remains of those taken before him. It was Moore who scrawled the first warning. The ash-marked ones trade in living flesh for favors not of this world. He escaped by setting fire to the administrative wing during a storm, fleeing into the woods. For weeks he lived in caves, surviving on roots, fevered and half-mad, until a passing Jesuit missionary found him. Moore told everything, and for that he vanished again. This time from all official records. No burial, no census, no church registry, but his bloodline survived, and to this day, men named Moore, O'Connor, and Byrne have a way of disappearing quietly when the 7-year cycles come. Check your own family. You might be one of them. And if you are, they've already marked you. You need to understand something. This isn't just about history, it's about control. You see, the disappearances at Sacred Heart weren't isolated. They were part of a system, a power structure older than the church, older than the crown, older than the written word itself. Every empire needs blood, not metaphorically, literally. The ancients understood this. The Phoenicians, the Canaanites, the priests of Baal. They didn't offer sacrifices because of superstition, but because it worked. Something watches. Something hungers. And in exchange for flesh, it grants influence, wealth, dominion over men's minds. Sacred Heart was a node, one of 7 in North America, each positioned along ley lines the old tribes knew. The rivers run the same courses, the hills, the old mounds, the burial sites, still in place. Look closely at where the major seminaries, Elite prep schools and mental hospitals were built between 1830 and 1930. Same lines, same rights. The institution traded bodies for power, then rewrote history to cover the exchange. But here's what they didn't account for. The blood remembers. Across generations, certain families bear the mark. A biological memory buried deep, an instinct for patterns, an unease in old places, a revulsion toward hollow-eyed clergy and empty rituals. That's you. And it's no accident you found this. By Section 31, you've proven you're a deviation, an anomaly. One they'll notice. And that's why right now, I need you to drop a phrase in the comments to lock yourself in, a signal to others watching this under surveillance, a code that marks you as awakened. Right, I carry the ash mark, twice. Once for you, once for the others who never made it this far. That phrase identifies you to the quiet network that still exists. Scattered men in cellars, on old landlines, in libraries with forbidden texts. Men who've seen what way, cast behind stained glass. Men who know the wheel is turning again. Once you type it, you're no longer a bystander, you're one of us. And what happens next, you'll never be able to unsee. Let's make this brutally clear. The Sacred Heart disappearances never stopped. They just changed venues. When the seminary finally shuttered in 1862, after a series of mysterious fires and an unexplainable sickness that left nearly half the town dead within weeks, the church publicly disbanded the institution. The official story was one of financial hardship, wartime instability, and dwindling vocations. But behind closed doors, the operation was simply relocated. The three false priests, Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien, were never recorded as deceased. No graves, no last rites, no public excommunication. And yet, their names begin appearing again. Not in Illinois, but in New York, in Montreal, in a remote monastery outside Quebec, where 14 men vanished in the winter of 1869 under circumstances nearly identical to Sacred Heart. Same patterns, same cover stories, same bloodlines. The practice endures because it works. The reason you felt the hair on your neck rise walking through ancient cathedrals. The reason so many old seminaries and hospitals were built atop native mounds and burial grounds. It's because the foundation was never for the living. It's a doorway, and every generation they must feed it. Look at your world now. How disappearances of certain groups, of certain men, are explained away with empty labels. Missing. Runaway. Mental instability, no foul play suspected, and no one asks the right questions, because they know what happens to those who do. Some are taken for sacrifice, some for binding, and some for replacement. Those hollow-eyed men you see on news broadcasts, in corner offices, behind altars and pulpits, they are not who they were. They wear the face. But the thing behind it is ancient. The same force that ruled Sacred Heart now wears suits, runs NGOs, owns think tanks, funds media outlets. The game evolved, but the hunger never left, and those bloodlines, still active, still marked. And if your heart's racing now, if you feel that tightening in your chest like something's watching you from beyond the room, it's because it is, and it knows your name. This is the part no one dares write down. The part whispered from dying mouths to a single ear. The part buried in private journals, burned after reading, spoken only once beneath eclipsed moons. The real reason Sacred Heart Seminary existed. The true commodity wasn't the young men, it wasn't even the blood, it was the names. You see, every human soul is anchored by its true name, a sequence of syllables and breath older than spoken language. A vibration in the unseen world that grants power to whatever holds it. Sacred Heart was a harvesting ground, not for bodies, for names. At baptism, a child is given a Christian name, but beneath it, concealed by ritual, lies the secret syllable, known only to the Creator and those who claim dominion. The false priests, the things wearing Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien, performed rites at night, extracting the sacred names from their victims. Once a name is taken, so is the soul's freedom. The body can live, the mind can function, but the will is no longer its own. The entity that holds the name can command, possess, erase, or wear it like a mask. That's why so many of those men disappeared without struggle. Why letters stopped mid-sentence. Why family heirlooms remained untouched. They weren't taken. They were emptied, and those names were sold to warlords, to empires, to secret councils cloaked in religious and legal authority. Those names powered wars, decided famines, bought immunity for monstrous acts. And some of those names still sit in locked vaults beneath ancient European cathedrals. Your name, your true, ancient, binding name, is your only defense. And here's the cruel truth. Most men alive today don't know theirs. It was stripped at birth by a ritual no one remembers. That's why the world feels the way it does. Why you feel watched, hollow, as if something behind your life is steering you into places you didn't choose. Because it is. But the moment you know this, a crack forms. And through that crack, light. That's why they buried Sacred Heart. Why they silenced men like Joseph Kennedy and Declan Moore. Because awareness itself disrupts the ritual. Now you know, and now you choose. Remain asleep, or hunt for your name. You're already marked, but you might still break free. The wheel turns, and now so do you.